53. Baby found mother bear. Protecting sacred forest from loggers. What happened next was heroic. The morning mist hung low between the pine trees, creating a veil that seemed to separate the forest from the rest of the world. Ethan Marshall adjusted his backpack straps and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. He had come to these woods seeking something he couldn't quite name, perhaps peace, perhaps answers to questions he hadn't yet formed. The locals in the small town at the base of the mountain had warned him about these particular woods, not with fear in their voices, but with something else, something that sounded almost like reverence. They called it the Whispering Woods, though when pressed for details they would simply shake their heads and change the subject. Ethan had been studying forest ecosystems for 15 years, and he thought he had seen everything nature had to offer. But there was something about the way the townspeople spoke of this place that made his scientific curiosity burn brighter than it had in years. The first thing he noticed as he entered the tree line was the silence. It wasn't the dead silence of winter or the oppressive quiet before a storm. This was different, softer somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. His boots made no sound on the thick carpet of pine needles, and even the birds seemed to sing in hushed tones, their melodies floating through the air like whispers. Ethan had read about old-growth forests having their own unique acoustic properties, how the density of the trees and the composition of the forest floor could create natural sound chambers, but this felt like something beyond mere physics. He pulled out his field notebook, the leather cover worn smooth from years of use, and began jotting down observations. The temperature was cooler here than it should have been for early September, and there was a quality to the light filtering through the canopy that made everything appear slightly golden, as if the sun itself was being transformed by passing through these ancient branches. As he ventured deeper into the woods, following what might have once been a deer trail, Ethan became aware of a sound that didn't quite fit. It was soft, so soft that at first he thought he was imagining it, but as he stopped and listened, really listened, he could hear it clearly. It was a humming, gentle and melodic, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed both random and purposeful. The scientist in him immediately began cataloging possibilities. Wind through a hollow tree, perhaps, or water running underground creating some kind of natural resonance. But as he moved toward the sound, it became clear that this was something else entirely. The humming had a quality to it that was unmistakably organic, almost human, yet not quite. It reminded him of the lullabies his grandmother used to sing, wordless melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest, songs that had no beginning or end, just an endless loop of comfort and warmth. The trail curved around a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that it would have taken 6 people holding hands to encircle it. Ethan placed his palm against the rough bark, feeling the life pulsing beneath, slow and steady like a heartbeat. The humming was louder now, and he could feel it as much as hear it, a vibration that seemed to travel through the ground and up into his bones. He rounded the tree slowly, his breath catching in his throat as the source of the sound came into view. There, in a small clearing where the sunlight pooled like liquid gold, sat the largest bear he had ever seen. But it wasn't the size of the creature that made him freeze in place, his hand still pressed against the oak for support. It was what the bear was doing, or rather, what it was watching over. In a natural depression in the earth, lined with the softest moss Ethan had ever seen, lay a baby. A human baby, no more than 6 months old, sleeping peacefully with one tiny fist curled against its cheek. The bear sat beside this impossible scene like a sentinel, her massive head swaying slightly from side to side as she hummed that strange, beautiful melody. Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. Every instinct he had as a biologist, Every piece of knowledge he had accumulated over his career told him this was impossible. Bears didn't care for human young, they certainly didn't sing to them. Yet here was the evidence before his eyes, undeniable and profound. The bear's eyes, dark and intelligent, shifted to look at him. Ethan expected to see aggression, the protective fury of a mother defending her young, but instead he saw something that looked almost like acknowledgement, as if she had been expecting him. She didn't stop humming, didn't move to block his view of the baby, just watched him with those ancient eyes that seemed to hold secrets he couldn't begin to fathom. Ethan slowly lowered himself to sit on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, his movements careful and deliberate. The bear watched him settle, then returned her gaze to the sleeping infant, her humming never faltering. Time seemed to move differently in that clearing. Ethan couldn't say how long he sat there, watching this impossible tableau, but the sun had shifted significantly when the baby finally stirred. The little one's eyes opened, revealing irises of the most startling blue, like pieces of sky that had fallen to earth. The baby didn't cry, didn't fuss, just looked up at the bear with what could only be described as recognition, and reached out one chubby hand to touch the thick fur of the bear's foreleg. The bear lowered her massive head so gently that Ethan held his breath and nuzzled the baby's cheek. The infant giggled, a sound so pure and joyful that Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes. He thought about reaching for his phone, about documenting this moment, but something stopped him. This felt sacred, private, like he had stumbled into a church during prayer. Instead, he simply watched as the bear continued her vigilant care, occasionally leaning down to sniff the baby, adjusting the moss beneath it with careful paws that could have easily crushed the fragile human, but instead moved with the delicacy of a master craftsman. The baby seemed completely at ease, babbling softly in that language all babies speak, reaching for the bear's nose, grasping at the air with tiny fingers. As the afternoon wore on, Ethan noticed other things about the clearing that defied explanation. The temperature here was perfect, neither too warm nor too cool, despite the changing angle of the sun. No insects bothered the baby, though Ethan could see mosquitoes and gnats dancing in the shafts of light just beyond the clearing's edge. The very air seemed cleaner here, filled with a sweetness that reminded him of honey and wildflowers, though neither were visible nearby. He made notes in his journal, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic as he tried to capture not just what he was seeing, but what he was feeling. There was a rightness to this scene that transcended logic, a sense that he was witnessing something that had always been and always would be. The bear's humming changed slightly, taking on a new rhythm, and Ethan watched in amazement as the baby's eyes began to droop. Within minutes, the infant was asleep again, one hand still resting on the bear's fur. The bear looked at Ethan once more, and he could have sworn he saw something like a question in those dark eyes. He found himself nodding, though he wasn't sure what he was agreeing to. The bear seemed satisfied with his response and settled more comfortably, her bulk creating a wall of warmth and protection around the sleeping child. Ethan knew he should leave, knew he should report this to someone, but he couldn't bring himself to move. There were so many questions racing through his mind. Where had this baby come from? How long had the bear been caring for it? Was the child in danger, or was this somehow exactly where it was meant to be? He thought about all the stories he had dismissed over the years, tales of children raised by wolves, of mysterious connections between humans and animals that science couldn't explain. He had always been a man of facts and data, but sitting here in this impossible clearing, he felt the foundations of his certainty beginning to shift. As the sun began to sink lower in the sky, painting the forest in shades of orange and purple, Ethan finally forced himself to stand. The bear watched him rise, her humming pausing for just a moment. He took a step backward, then another, not wanting to turn his back on the scene, as if looking away might cause it to vanish like a dream upon waking. The bear resumed her lullaby, the sound following him as he made his way back through the woods. Even after he could no longer see the clearing, he could still hear that gentle humming, growing fainter with distance, but never quite disappearing entirely. The walk back to town took longer than the journey out, or perhaps it just felt that way because Ethan's mind was spinning with the implications of what he had witnessed. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He stood at the tree line for a long moment, looking back into the depths of the whispering woods, wondering if he had imagined it all. But the notes in his journal were real. The dirt on his boots was real. And the feeling in his chest, a mixture of awe and responsibility, was definitely real. The town was quiet as he walked down Main Street, most of the shops already closed for the evening. But the small library was still lit, and through the window, Ethan could see an elderly woman organizing books on a cart. Something about her purposeful movements, the way she handled each book with reverence, made him pause. He pushed open the door, a small bell chiming his arrival, and the woman looked up with eyes that seemed to hold the same ancient quality as the bear's. "You've been to the woods," she said. It wasn't a question. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak just yet. The woman, whose name tag read Lily Morgan, head librarian, set down the book she was holding and studied him with those knowing eyes. "You saw something," she continued, her voice soft but certain. "Something that shouldn't exist, but does." Ethan found himself telling her everything, the words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam. Lily listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if his story confirmed something she had long suspected. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then walked to a section of the library he hadn't noticed before, a small alcove filled with old, leather-bound volumes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. She pulled one from the shelf, its binding cracked with age, and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "My grandmother kept these records," Lily said, running her finger along lines of handwritten text. "Stories that go back generations, tales that most people dismiss as folklore. But those of us who have lived here long enough, we know better." The Whispering Woods have always been special, a place where the boundary between what we think we know and what actually is becomes thin. She showed him the page, covered in careful script that told of other sightings, other impossible moments witnessed in those ancient woods. Bears that walked upright during the full moon, trees that sang during thunderstorms, and yes, stories of lost children found and protected by the forest itself. "But a baby," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, "a living baby being cared for by a bear. How is that possible?" Lily closed the book gently and looked at him with a small smile. "The same way a seed knows to grow toward the sun, the same way birds know to fly, south for winter. There are laws in this universe that we haven't written down in our science books yet. The woods, they have their own wisdom, their own way of maintaining balance." She walked to another shelf and pulled down a more recent-looking journal, its pages yellowed but not ancient. "3 weeks ago," she said, opening to a marked page, "a young woman came through town. She was troubled, desperate. She had a baby with her, but she was running from something or someone. She asked about the woods, specifically about the old stories. I tried to discourage her from going in alone, but she was determined. She said she had nowhere else to turn, that she had heard the forest protected those who truly needed it." Lily paused, her expression sad. She never came back out. Search parties found no trace of her, and everyone assumed she had continued on through the forest to the other side of the mountain. But the baby stayed, Ethan finished, understanding beginning to dawn. Lily nodded. If the stories are true, and I believe they are, the forest chooses who to protect. That bear, she's not just any bear. In the old tales, they call her the Guardian, though she's had many names over the years. She appears when she's needed, when there's an innocent life that requires protection. Ethan thought about the intelligence he had seen in the bear's eyes, the deliberate way she had cared for the infant. But surely someone should be notified. The authorities, child services. Lily's expression grew serious. And tell them what? That a bear is raising a human baby in the woods? They'd tranquilize the bear, take the child, probably destroy half the forest looking for explanations. Sometimes, Mr. Marshall, the best thing we can do is trust in mysteries we don't fully understand. She pulled out a chair and gestured for him to sit. But I sense that's not the whole story. There's something else happening in the woods, isn't there? Something that threatens this delicate balance? Ethan hadn't consciously noticed it at the time, but now, thinking back, he remembered. In the distance, barely audible over the bear's humming, there had been another sound, the rhythmic thud of machinery, the distant whine of chainsaws. Logging, he said, the word feeling heavy in his mouth. There's logging happening somewhere in the forest. Lily's face paled slightly. The Fletcher Logging Company. They got permits last month to clear a section of the forest for development. The town council fought it, but the state overruled us. They're supposed to stay in the designated area, but... She trailed off, and Ethan could fill in the blanks. Logging companies rarely stayed within their boundaries, especially when there was good timber just beyond the marked trees. The bear, Ethan said slowly. She kept looking in one direction, toward the east. At the time, I thought she was just being vigilant, but now I wonder if she was aware of the threat. Lily stood and walked to a map on the wall, an old topographical representation of the area. She traced a finger along the eastern edge of the Whispering Woods. If they follow their usual pattern, they'll reach the heart of the forest within a week, maybe less. And if the old stories are true, if that's where the Guardian makes her home, they'll destroy everything, Ethan finished. The clearing, the baby, all of it. He thought about the perfect peace of that small clearing, the impossible harmony of bear and child, and felt something fierce rise up in his chest. We have to do something. Lily looked at him with those ancient eyes and smiled sadly. We, Mr. Marshall, you've known about this for all of a few hours. But even as she said it, Ethan could see she was pleased. Though I suppose once the forest shows you something like that, you're part of it, whether you want to be or not. She pulled out a notebook of her own, more modern than the historical texts, and began writing. There are others who need to know about this, people who understand what the Whispering Woods really are. But first, you need to go back. Back? Ethan asked, though he already knew what she meant. Oh, back to the clearing. Oh, the Guardian showed you the child for a reason. She doesn't reveal herself to just anyone. In all the stories my grandmother collected, it only happened a handful of times, and always when the forest needed human help. Lily tore the page from her notebook and handed it to him. These are directions to places in the woods that most people never find. Sacred spaces, my grandmother called them. If the Guardian trusts you, she might show you more. Ethan looked at the paper, seeing hand-drawn landmarks and cryptic notes. And what am I supposed to do if she does? Lily's smile was mysterious. That, Mr. Marshall, is between you and the forest. But I suspect you'll know when the time comes. The woods have a way of making things clear to those who are willing to listen. That night, Ethan barely slept. He lay in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every moment in the clearing. The baby's blue eyes, the bear's gentle humming, the perfect impossibility of it all. When he did drift off, he dreamed of forests that went on forever, of trees that whispered secrets in languages older than human speech, and of a bear that walked between worlds, carrying safety in her massive paws. He woke before dawn, Lily's directions clutched in his hand, and knew with absolute certainty that he was going back. Not as a scientist this time, not as an observer, but as something else. A participant, perhaps. A protector. The word felt right in his mind, though he wasn't sure what exactly he was meant to protect or from whom. He dressed quickly, filled his backpack with supplies, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. The forest was different in the early morning, wrapped in a thick mist that made everything look dreamlike and insubstantial. Ethan followed the main trail at first, then veered off according to Lily's directions, looking for a lightning-struck pine that marked the first turn. He found it easily, its blackened trunk standing out against the pale mist, and turned north, counting his steps as the directions indicated. The path Lily had described didn't look like a path at all. It was more of a suggestion, a slight parting in the undergrowth that might have been made by deer, or might have been there since the forest began. As he walked, Ethan noticed things he had missed the day before. Symbols carved into tree trunks, so old they had become part of the bark itself. Arrangements of stones that looked natural but were too perfectly placed to be accidental. The forest was full of signs for those who knew how to read them. The humming reached him before he reached the clearing, that same melodious sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. But this time, there was something different about it. A urgency, perhaps, or maybe it was just his imagination adding meaning where there was none. He approached slowly, making enough noise that the bear would hear him coming, not wanting to startle her. She was exactly where he had left her, still watching over the sleeping baby, but her posture was different. More alert, her head raised and turning slowly as if scanning for danger. When she saw him, she made a sound he hadn't heard from her before, a soft chuff that somehow conveyed both greeting and warning. Ethan stopped at the edge of the clearing, waiting for permission to approach. The bear studied him for a long moment, then lowered her head in what looked like a nod. As he stepped into the clearing, Ethan felt that same sense of crossing a threshold, of entering a space that existed outside normal reality. The baby was awake this time, lying on its back and reaching for the dancing motes of light that filtered through the canopy. The infant turned its head at Ethan's approach, those startling blue eyes focusing on him with an intensity that seemed impossible for one so young. Then the baby smiled, a toothless, perfect smile that made Ethan's heart constrict with an emotion he couldn't name. The bear made another sound, longer this time, almost like speech. She rose to her feet, her massive frame casting a shadow over the baby, and looked pointedly toward the east. Ethan followed her gaze and could hear it more clearly now, the sound of machinery, closer than it had been yesterday. The logging operation was moving faster than Lily had predicted. The bear looked back at him, and in her eyes he saw something that looked like a question, or maybe a request. "You want me to stop them," he said aloud, feeling slightly foolish talking to a bear. But she chuffed again, a sound that seemed affirmative, and then did something that made Ethan's jaw drop. She walked, with careful steps, to a specific tree at the edge of the clearing and placed her paw against it. The tree, an ancient pine with a trunk, wider than Ethan could wrap his arms around, had a hollow at its base. The bear looked at him, then at the hollow, then back at him. Ethan approached slowly, kneeling beside the hollow. Inside, wrapped in what looked like deerskin, was something that made no sense. It was a collection of papers, modern papers, covered in legal text. As he pulled them out and examined them, his confusion grew. They were documents, ownership documents, dating back over 100 years, all for this specific piece of forest. But the names on the documents were impossible. They showed the land being passed down through a family line that, according to the dates, would have made each owner over 150 years old when they transferred the property. At the bottom of the stack was a newer document, dated just a month ago. It was a will, signed by someone named Margaret Ashford, leaving the land to the one who guards. Ethan looked up at the bear, his mind reeling. This can't be real. But even as he said it, he knew it was. Lily's grandmother's name had been Margaret. Margaret Morgan before she married, Margaret Ashford. The bear moved back to the baby, settling beside the infant with a protective presence. She looked at Ethan once more, and he understood. The forest had been protected by legal means as long as possible, but now those protections were being challenged. The logging company had found some loophole, some way around the old agreements. But if someone could prove the land was still privately owned, still protected by these documents, the logging would have to stop. Ethan carefully rewrapped the papers and stood. "I'll take these to Lily," he said, knowing the bear couldn't understand his words but hoping she understood his intent. "We'll find a way to stop them." The bear's humming resumed, softer now, almost like a lullaby of gratitude. The baby cooed, reaching for Ethan with one tiny hand. He knelt beside the infant, letting those small fingers wrap around one of his own, and felt a connection form that transcended species and logic. "I'll protect you," he whispered, not sure if he was talking to the baby or the bear or the forest itself. "All of you." The baby gurgled happily, and the bear leaned down to nuzzle Ethan's shoulder, a gesture so gentle from such a powerful creature that it brought tears to his eyes. He stayed there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had just accepted, then carefully extracted his finger from the baby's grip and stood. The journey back to town felt different this time. The forest seemed to part before him, making his passage easier. Birds called out as he passed, not in alarm, but in what sounded like acknowledgement. Even the mist seemed to guide him, clearing just enough to show him the path. He held the documents against his chest, protecting them from the moisture, feeling their importance like a physical weight. Lily was waiting for him at the library, as if she had known he would return this morning. Her eyes went immediately to the bundle in his arms, and her expression shifted from curiosity to something like awe. "She showed you," she said softly. "The guardian actually showed you." Ethan handed her the documents, watching as she carefully unwrapped them, her hands trembling slightly. As she read through them, her eyes widened. My grandmother. She knew this day would come. She prepared for it. But how? Ethan asked. How could she have known? How could any of this be possible? Lily looked up at him with those ancient eyes, and for a moment he could see her grandmother in her face. The same way the forest knows when to change colors in the fall, the same way the salmon know when to return to their birthplace. There are patterns in this world, mister. Marshall, cycles that repeat whether we understand them or not. My grandmother was part of those patterns, as was her mother before her, and hers before that. We've been the keepers of the forest's secrets for generations. She spread the documents out on the table, examining each one carefully. These are legitimate. They'll hold up in court, but we need to act fast. The logging company has good lawyers, and they'll challenge everything they can. She pulled out her phone, an incongruous sight given the ancient nature of their discussion. "I know someone, a lawyer in the state capitol who specializes in environmental law and historical land claims. She's been waiting for a case like this." As Lily made her calls, Ethan found himself drawn back to the window, looking toward the forest. Even from here he could feel its pull, that sense of connection that had formed in the clearing. He thought about the baby, wondered about its mother, the desperate woman who had trusted the forest with her child's life. What had she been running from? What had driven her to such an extreme decision? "Mr. Marshall." Lily's voice drew him from his thoughts. "My contact wants to meet with us immediately. She says if we can file an injunction by end of business today, we can halt the logging operation while the courts review the case." She gathered the documents carefully, placing them in a protective folder. "But she also said we need more. The documents establish ownership, but we need to prove the land has special significance, something that would make clearing it a crime beyond just trespassing." Ethan thought about the clearing, the baby, the guardian. "We can't tell them about the bear and the baby. They'd never believe us, and even if they did," Lily nodded, "it would put them in danger. No, we need something else. The sacred sites, perhaps. If we can prove the forest has historical and cultural significance to the indigenous peoples who once lived here, that might be enough." They spent the next hours gathering evidence, pulling old books and records that documented the forest's history. Ethan was amazed at the depth of Lily's collection. Generation after generation of careful documentation. There were drawings of petroglyphs found deep in the woods, accounts of vision quests undertaken by native peoples, stories of healing springs and sacred groves. It was a comprehensive record of a place that was far more than just trees and earth. As they worked, Ethan became aware of a change in the sounds coming from outside. The distant thud of machinery had stopped. At first, he thought it might be a lunch break, but as the silence stretched on, he began to hope. "Maybe they've already stopped," he said, but Lily shook her head. "More likely they're repositioning, preparing to move into a new section." "We don't have much time." The drive to the state capitol was tense, both of them aware that every minute counted. Lily's contact, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Chen, met them at her office, already prepared with the necessary paperwork. She reviewed the documents with professional efficiency, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification. "This is solid," she finally said. "The chain of ownership is clear, and the historical significance is well documented. But I need to know, is there anything else, anything that might come up that could damage our case?" Ethan and Lily exchanged glances. How could they explain about the guardian, about the baby? Rebecca seemed to sense their hesitation. "Look, I've worked environmental law for 20 years. I've seen things that don't make it into the official reports. I'm not asking you to tell me everything, but I need to know if there's something that could blindside us in court." "There are residents in the forest," Lily said carefully. "Vulnerable residents who would be harmed if the logging continues. We can't provide details without putting them at risk, but their safety is paramount." Rebecca studied them for a moment, then nodded. "Understood. We'll focus on the land ownership and historical significance. The injunction should buy us enough time to build a stronger case." The next hours were a blur of legal procedures, filed documents, and tense phone calls. By late afternoon, they had their injunction. The logging operation was ordered to cease immediately pending a full review of the land claims. Rebecca assured them it was a strong temporary measure, but warned that the real fight was just beginning. The logging company would challenge everything, would bring their own experts and lawyers. They needed to be prepared for a long battle. On the drive back to town, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. They had bought time, but how much? And what would happen to the baby in the meantime? Winter was coming, and while the bear seemed capable of providing care, a human infant had needs that no animal, no matter how extraordinary, could fully meet. "We need a long-term solution," he said to Lily as they neared the town. "The legal battle could take months, even years. The baby can't stay in the forest indefinitely." Lily was quiet for a moment, then said, "Unless that's exactly where the baby is meant to be. You saw the clearing, Mr. Marshall. You felt it. That child isn't just being protected by the forest, it's part of it somehow. The guardian doesn't make mistakes." They arrived back in town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Ethan walked Lily to the library, then found himself continuing on toward the forest. He needed to check on them, to make sure they were safe. The path was familiar now, his feet finding their way even in the gathering darkness. The forest welcomed him like an old friend, the trees seeming to lean in as he passed, their branches creating a tunnel of green. He heard the humming before he reached the clearing, but there was something different about it tonight. It was multi-layered, as if more than one voice was contributing to the melody. As he approached, he saw why. The clearing was not empty except for the bear and baby. There were others. A doe stood at the edge of the space, her head lowered toward the infant. A pair of rabbits sat nearby, their usual skittishness absent. An owl perched on a low branch, its large eyes fixed on the baby with what looked like protective vigilance. The guardian sat in the middle of this gathering, the baby cradled between her massive paws. The infant was awake, making soft sounds that seemed to harmonize with the humming that filled the clearing. It was like nothing Ethan had ever witnessed. A congregation of species united in protection of one small life. He stood at the edge of the clearing, afraid to break whatever spell had been woven here. The bear looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw knowledge. Somehow, she knew what he and Lily had done, knew that the immediate threat had been paused. She chuffed softly, a sound that the other animals seemed to understand as permission. The doe stepped forward, delicately sniffing the baby's hair. The rabbits hopped closer, their noses twitching. Even the owl descended from its perch, landing near the baby with silent grace. Ethan watched in wonder as each animal seemed to pay its respects to the infant, as if acknowledging something he couldn't quite grasp. The baby, for its part, seemed delighted by the attention, reaching out with chubby hands toward each visitor, giggling when the rabbit's whiskers tickled its palm. It was a scene from a fairy tale, too perfect to be real, yet undeniably happening right before his eyes. As the animals began to disperse, returning to their nocturnal activities, the guardian looked at Ethan and made a gesture he hadn't seen before. She lifted one paw and placed it over her heart, then extended it toward him. It was unmistakably a gesture of gratitude, of acknowledgement. Ethan felt tears on his cheeks as he returned the gesture, placing his hand over his own heart and then extending it toward her. The baby yawned, its tiny mouth opening wide, and the guardian immediately turned her attention back to her charge. She began humming, again, that low, soothing melody that seemed to come from the earth itself. Within minutes, the baby was asleep, safe in the circle of the bear's protection. Ethan stayed a while longer, letting the peace of the clearing wash over him, then quietly made his way back through the forest. That night, he dreamed of the clearing again, but this time it was different. The baby was older, a toddler now, walking on unsteady legs between the trees. The guardian was still there, watching with those patient eyes, but the child moved with confidence, as if the forest was its natural habitat. In the dream, the child turned to look at him, and its eyes were no longer blue but green. the exact shade of the forest canopy. The child smiled and beckoned him forward, and just before he woke, he heard it speak a single word in a voice that sounded like wind through leaves: home. The next morning brought new challenges. The logging company had already filed a counterclaim, arguing that the documents were forgeries, that the land had been abandoned and therefore fell under state jurisdiction. Rebecca called early with updates, her voice tense but determined. They're moving fast, trying to overwhelm us with paperwork. But our case is solid. The historical records Lily provided are authenticated, and the chain of ownership is clear. It's going to be a fight, but we can win this. Ethan spent the morning helping Lily organize more documentation, but his mind kept drifting to the clearing. The image of the animals gathered around the baby stayed with him, raising questions he couldn't answer. Was the forest itself sentient in some way? Was the guardian more than just an unusual bear? And what would happen to the baby if they couldn't protect the land? Around midday, they received an unexpected visitor. A man in his 60s, wearing the rough clothes of someone who worked with his hands, entered the library. His face was weathered but kind, and his eyes held a familiar quality that Ethan couldn't quite place. "Miss Morgan," he said, removing his cap. "Mr. Marshall, my name is Michael Hayes. I'm the foreman for the logging operation." Ethan tensed, but Lily held up a hand, studying the man carefully. "Mr. Hayes, I'm surprised to see you here." Michael twisted his cap in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. "I heard about the injunction. My bosses aren't happy, told us to prepare to resume the moment it's lifted. But—" He paused, struggling with his words. "My grandmother used to tell stories about these woods, said they were special, protected. I never believed them, thought they were just tales to keep kids from getting lost. But lately, I've been having dreams." "Dreams?" Lily prompted gently. Michael nodded, his discomfort growing. "About a bear and a baby. I know how it sounds, but the dreams are so vivid. The bear, she looks at me like she's trying to tell me something. And there's this feeling like I'm about to do something terrible, something I can't take back." He looked up at them, his eyes pleading. "Is there truth to the old stories? Is there something in those woods that we'd be destroying?" Ethan and Lily exchanged glances. This was unexpected, potentially game-changing. If the foreman himself was having doubts, if he could be made an ally rather than an enemy. "Mr. Hayes," Ethan said carefully, "what would you say if I told you the dreams weren't just dreams? That there are things in those woods that science can't explain, but that doesn't make them less real?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I'd say my grandmother was right, and I've been a fool to ignore her wisdom." He straightened, seeming to come to a decision. "I can't stop the operation on my own. The company has contracts, deadlines, but I can slow things down, give you more time. And maybe you could show me what my grandmother knew, what I should have listened to years ago." Lily stood, moving to one of her special shelves. She pulled down a journal, one Ethan hadn't seen before, and handed it to Michael. "This was written by Sarah Hayes in 1892, your great-great-grandmother, I believe." Michael's hands shook as he took the journal, opening it to see the familiar handwriting he remembered from old family letters. She was one of the keepers, Mr. Hayes. One of those who knew the forest's secrets and protected them. That knowledge was supposed to pass to you, but somewhere along the way, the chain was broken. Michael read in silence, his expression changing from skepticism to wonder to something like shame. "She wrote about the guardian," he said softly, "about a promise made to protect the forest and all who dwelt within it." He looked up, tears in his eyes. "I've been about to break a promise my family made over a century ago. "It's not too late," Lily said gently. "The forest remembers even when we forget. And it seems it's calling you back." Michael closed the journal carefully, holding it like the treasure it was. "Show me," he said. "Show me what I've been blind to. And then tell me how I can help." The three of them entered the forest as the afternoon sun slanted through the trees. Michael walked like a man in a dream, his eyes taking in details he had overlooked for years. The symbols on the trees, the arranged stones, the paths that seemed to appear just when needed. "I've been in forests all my life," he said quietly, "but I've never felt anything like this. It's like the trees are alive in a way that goes beyond biology." As they neared the clearing, the humming reached them, and Michael stopped in his tracks. "That's the sound from my dreams," he whispered. "Exactly that sound." Ethan put a hand on his shoulder. "What you're about to see might challenge everything you believe about the world. Are you ready for that?" Michael took a deep breath and nodded. They entered the clearing together, and Ethan watched the man's face transform as he took in the scene. The guardian sat in her usual place, the baby playing with a collection of smooth stones that had somehow appeared since Ethan's last visit. The bear looked up at their approach, her gaze settling on Michael with an intensity that made him take a step back. "My God," Michael breathed. "It's real. It's all real." The baby looked up at the sound of his voice, those blue eyes focusing on him with that uncanny intensity. Then the infant smiled and held out one of the stones toward him, a gesture of innocent offering that broke something in the man. He fell to his knees at the edge of the clearing, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he said, though whether he was addressing the bear, the baby, or the forest itself was unclear. "I didn't know. I didn't believe." The guardian made that soft chuffing sound, and somehow it conveyed forgiveness, understanding. She rose and walked toward Michael, each step deliberate and graceful despite her size. She stopped just in front of him, lowering her massive head until they were eye to eye. For a long moment they stayed like that, man and bear, locked in silent communication. Then the guardian did something extraordinary. She turned and walked back to the baby, but instead of resuming her protective position, she gently nudged the infant toward Michael. The baby, seemingly understanding, crawled forward with determination, crossing the few feet of moss-covered ground until it reached the kneeling man. Michael looked at Ethan and Lily, seeking permission or guidance, and Lily nodded encouragingly. With shaking hands, he reached out and lifted the baby, holding it with the careful reverence of someone handling sacred relics. The infant studied his face solemnly for a moment, then reached up and patted his weathered cheek with one tiny hand. Michael made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, holding the baby close. "This changes everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I thought I knew, everything I thought mattered." He looked at the guardian, who was watching with those patient ancient eyes. "I won't let them hurt you. Any of you. I'll find a way." They stayed in the clearing until the sun began to set, Michael holding the baby while the guardian watched, occasionally humming that strange, beautiful melody. The infant seemed completely at ease with this new person, playing with the buttons on his shirt, babbling in that universal baby language. It was another impossible scene. The gruff logging foreman cradling a baby while a massive bear supervised, but it felt entirely natural in this sacred space. As they prepared to leave, Michael carefully handed the baby back to the guardian, who accepted her charge with gentle pause. "I need to think," he said. "Need to figure out how to handle this. My crew, they're good people, but this is beyond what most folks can accept." He turned to Lily. "Can I keep my great-great-grandmother's journal?" I want to read all of it, understand what my family was meant to be. Of course, Lily said. It belongs with you. It always has. As they walked back through the darkening forest, Michael was quiet, processing everything he had witnessed. Just before they reached the town, he stopped. The company has investors coming tomorrow. Big presentation about the timber value of this section of forest. What if I could convince them there's more value in preservation than destruction? How? Ethan asked. Michael's expression was thoughtful. Ecotourism is big business these days, and if we could prove this forest has unique properties, rare species, historical significance, the investors care about profit, not specifically about logging. If we could show them a different path to profit, one that keeps the forest intact. It was a long shot, but it was something. They agreed to meet early the next morning to strategize. As Michael walked away, still clutching his ancestor's journal, Lily turned to Ethan. The forest chose well, showing itself to him. He has the power to stop this from the inside. Ethan nodded, but he was thinking about the baby, about the approaching winter, about all the challenges that lay ahead even if they succeeded in protecting the land. That night, he couldn't sleep. He stood at his hotel window, looking toward the forest, and made a decision. Grabbing his jacket and a flashlight, he headed out into the darkness. The forest at night was a different world, full of sounds and movements that daylight obscured. But he felt no fear, only a sense of purpose as he made his way to the clearing. The guardian was awake, sitting upright, the baby sleeping peacefully against her warm bulk. She looked up at his approach, unsurprised. Ethan sat on his usual log, and for a while they simply existed in each other's presence, two protectors watching over one small life. Then the guardian did something new. She rose carefully, ensuring the baby remained asleep, and walked to the edge of the clearing. She looked back at him, clearly expecting him to follow. She led him deeper into the forest, to places he hadn't seen before. They walked for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, the bear moving with surprising silence for such a large creature. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, larger than the first, and Ethan gasped. The trees here were ancient, their trunks massive and gnarled with age, but more than that, they were glowing, a soft phosphorescent light emanating from the bark itself. In the center of the clearing was a spring, its water so clear it seemed to disappear, only visible by the slight distortion it created. The guardian walked to the spring and drank, then looked at Ethan expectantly. He knelt beside the water, cupping it in his hands and bringing it to his lips. It was cold and sweet, and as he drank, he felt something shift inside him, a connection forming that went deeper than consciousness. Suddenly, he understood. Not everything, not the full mystery of the forest, but enough. The baby wasn't just being protected here, it was being prepared. For what? He couldn't say, but he knew with absolute certainty that this child had a destiny tied to these woods, to the guardian, to something larger than any of them could fully grasp. The forest wasn't just a collection of trees, it was a living entity, ancient and wise, and it had chosen them all for roles in a story that was still being written. The guardian led him back to the first clearing, where the baby still slept peacefully. She settled back into her protective position and looked at him with those knowing eyes. Ethan understood that he had been shown something sacred, something that few humans had ever witnessed. He was no longer just an observer or even a protector. He was part of the forest's story now, woven into its fabric as surely as the trees and the streams. As dawn approached, painting the sky in soft pastels, Ethan made his way back to town. He felt different. changed in ways he couldn't articulate. The world looked the same, but he saw it differently, noticed the connections between things, the patterns that had always been there, but that he had been blind to. He thought about Michael's investors, about the presentation that would happen in just a few hours, and knew what needed to be done. He met Michael and Lily at the library just as it opened. Michael looked haggard, as if he too had spent the night wrestling with impossible truths. "I've been thinking," he said without preamble. "The investors, they're city people. They think of forests as resources, not as living things. We need to show them something that will shift their perspective, make them see what we see." "We can't show them The Guardian," Lily said immediately. "That would put her and the baby at risk." Michael nodded. "I know, but what if we could show them the glowing trees? Ethan, you mentioned seeing something last night." Ethan described the second clearing, the ancient trees with their phosphorescent bark. Michael's eyes lit up. "That's it. That's our hook. Bioluminescent trees are incredibly rare. If we can prove they exist here, scientists will come from around the world to study them. The forest would become a research site, protected by its scientific value." They spent the morning preparing, gathering what evidence they could, crafting a presentation that would shift the narrative from destruction to preservation. When the investors arrived, 3 men in expensive suits who looked out of place in the small town, Michael met them with a confidence that surprised everyone, including himself. "Gentlemen," he said, leading them into the library's meeting room. "I know you're expecting a presentation about timber values, but I have something far more valuable to show you." He began with the historical significance, Lily presenting the documents and stories with scholarly authority. The investors looked skeptical but interested. Then Michael showed them photos Ethan had managed to take off the glowing trees, images that even in daylight showed the unusual properties of the bark. "This forest," Michael said, his passion evident, "isn't just trees. It's a living laboratory, a place where nature has created something unique. We could make more money from research grants and ecotourism than we ever could from logging. Universities would pay for access. Documentary crews would come from around the world. This place could become the crown jewel of environmental preservation, and you could be the visionaries who recognized its value." The investors exchanged glances, and one of them, the eldest, leaned forward. "These glowing trees, they're real? Not some trick of photography?" Michael looked him in the eye. "Sir, I've been in forests my whole life, and I've never seen anything like what's in those woods. It's not just the trees. The whole ecosystem is unique, interconnected in ways we're only beginning to understand. Destroying it would be like burning the Library of Alexandria. We'd be destroying knowledge we haven't even discovered yet." The discussion continued for hours, the investors asking pointed questions about profit potential, about logistics, about guarantees. But Ethan could see the shift happening, the moment when greed transformed into something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or even wonder. By the end of the meeting, they had agreed to halt the logging operation indefinitely while they explored the alternatives Michael had presented. As the investors left, the eldest lingered behind. He was a man in his 70s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Hayes," he said quietly, "there's more to this forest than glowing trees, isn't there? Something you're not telling us." Michael met his gaze steadily. "Sir, there are things in those woods that can't be put in a business proposal. Things that have to be experienced to be believed." The old man nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to tell stories about forests like that. Places where the veil between worlds was thin. I never believed her. He pulled out a business card, expensive stock with minimal text. "When you're ready to show me what you're really protecting, give me a call. Some things are worth more than money, Mr. Hayes." It took me 70 years to learn that, but I did learn it. After he left, the three protectors stood in silence for a moment, hardly believing what had just happened. They had done it, or at least bought significantly more time. The forest was safe for now, the guardian and the baby protected. But Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The baby would grow, the forest would continue to reveal its secrets, and they would need to remain vigilant. That evening, they returned to the clearing together, bringing supplies that might be useful, blankets, food that wouldn't spoil, things that could help the guardian care for her unusual charge. The bear accepted their offerings with that same patient grace, and the baby seemed delighted by the new items, particularly a soft blue blanket that it immediately clutched to its chest. As they sat in the clearing, watching the baby play while the guardian hummed her eternal lullaby, Ethan thought about the journey that had brought him here. He had come to the forest seeking solitude, and had found a purpose he never expected. The scientist in him still struggled to explain what he was witnessing, but the human in him didn't need explanations. Some truths transcended scientific understanding. The hidden path revealed itself to Ethan like a secret whispered by the wind itself, appearing between two ancient oaks that had grown so close together their branches formed a natural archway overhead. He had walked past this spot dozens of times in the past weeks, but this morning, with the guardian leading the way, the opening was as clear as if someone had drawn a door in the forest wall. The massive bear moved with surprising grace, her bulk seeming to flow between the trees rather than push through them, and cradled in her careful jaws was a bundle wrapped in the soft blue blanket they had brought days ago. Inside that bundle, the baby slept peacefully, trusting completely in its unusual protector's gentle grip. Lily walked beside Ethan, her weathered hands clutching her grandmother's journal, her eyes bright with anticipation and something that looked like recognition. She had been waiting for this moment, he realized, perhaps for years, perhaps her whole life. The stories passed down through generations of her family were about to become reality, and she moved with the careful reverence of someone entering a cathedral. Behind them, Michael Hayes followed, his heavy work boots making no sound on the moss-covered path, his face set in an expression of determined wonder that had replaced his earlier skepticism entirely. The path wound deeper into the forest than any of them had ventured before, leading them through groves of trees that looked older than time itself, their trunks so massive that it would have taken a dozen people holding hands to encircle them. The air grew thicker here, not with humidity but with something else, a presence that seemed to watch their passage with ancient eyes. Mushrooms glowed softly in the shadowy understory, not with the phosphorescence Ethan had witnessed in the other clearing, but with a light that seemed to come from within, as if they had swallowed fallen stars and were slowly digesting them. The guardian paused at a stream that cut across their path, the water running so clear it was like liquid crystal, and she turned to look at them with those knowing eyes. She set the bundle down gently on a flat rock, and the baby stirred but didn't wake, one tiny hand emerging from the blanket to grasp at the air. The bear lowered her massive head to the water and drank, then looked at each of them in turn, clearly indicating they should do the same. Ethan knelt first, cupping the water in his hands, and as he drank, he felt that same shift he had experienced at the glowing spring, but stronger this time, as if the forest was claiming him more completely with each sip. Lily drank next, and as the water touched her lips, tears began to stream down her face, though her expression was one of joy rather than sorrow. "I can feel her," she whispered, and Ethan knew she meant her grandmother, or perhaps all the grandmothers who had come before, all the keepers of the forest's secrets. Michael was the last to drink, and as he did, his whole body seemed to relax, tension he had carried for years flowing out of him like the stream itself. When they had all drunk from the forest's water, the guardian picked up the baby again and continued on, leading them deeper into the mystery. The trees began to change as they walked, their bark taking on a golden hue that grew more pronounced with each step. The leaves above them rustled with a sound like whispered conversations, and Ethan could have sworn he heard words in that rustling, though in no language he recognized. Birds appeared on branches as they passed, not flying away as wildlife usually did, but watching with bright, intelligent eyes, some of them singing songs that harmonized with each other in ways that suggested deliberate composition rather than instinct. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, the path opened into a grove that took their breath away. The trees here weren't just glowing, they were radiant, their bark seeming to pulse with a heartbeat of light that matched the rhythm of their own hearts. The ground was carpeted with flowers that shouldn't have been able to grow in such deep shade, yet they thrived, their petals every color imaginable, and some that seemed to exist outside the normal spectrum of visible light. In the center of this impossible garden was a pool of water, perfectly circular, its surface so still it looked like a mirror made of liquid silver. The guardian approached the pool and set the baby down on a bed of moss at its edge. The infant woke then, those startling blue eyes opening to take in the grove, and instead of crying at the strange surroundings, the baby laughed, a sound of pure delight that echoed through the trees and seemed to make the lights pulse brighter. The bear sat back on her haunches and began to hum, but this time the sound was different, more complex with harmonies that no single throat should have been able to produce. As they watched, other animals began to emerge from the forest. Not just the deer and rabbits Ethan had seen before, but creatures that seemed almost mythical in their presence. A white stag with antlers that caught and reflected the tree light like prisms, creating tiny rainbows in the air. A fox whose fur seemed to shift colors as it moved, sometimes red, sometimes silver, sometimes a shade that had no name. An ancient turtle whose shell was covered in moss and tiny flowers, as if it was a piece of the forest floor that had decided to walk. Each creature approached the pool and the baby with the same reverent care, and each added its voice to the guardian's song, creating a symphony that was both utterly inhuman and deeply moving. Lily stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate, and knelt beside the pool. She opened her grandmother's journal to a page near the back, one covered in symbols rather than words, and began to trace those symbols in the air with her finger. As she did, the water in the pool began to move, swirling slowly at first, then faster, creating a whirlpool that somehow remained perfectly silent. Images formed in the spinning water, scenes from the past that told a story without words. They saw the forest as it had been centuries ago, even more vast and mysterious than it was now. They saw the first peoples who had lived here, not as conquerors of nature, but as participants in it, learning the forest's secrets and becoming part of its story. They saw the arrival of settlers, some who understood and respected the forest's power, others who sought to dominate it. They saw Lily's ancestors, a line of women who had stood between the forest and those who would harm it, keepers of knowledge that couldn't be written down but had to be lived to be understood. And then they saw something that made them all gasp. A young woman, clearly desperate, running through the forest with a baby in her arms. But this wasn't recent. The clothing suggested it was decades ago. The woman reached this very grove, knelt by this very pool, and offered her child to the forest's protection. The guardian appeared, the same bear or perhaps an ancestor, and accepted the child. That baby grew up in the forest, learned its ways, became part of its magic, and eventually returned to the human world with gifts of healing and wisdom that helped bridge the gap between the two worlds. The vision shifted, and they saw this pattern repeated throughout history. Every few generations, when the forest was threatened or when the human world had strayed too far from natural harmony, a child would be given to the forest's care. These children became shamans, healers, teachers, people who could walk between worlds and help maintain the balance. The baby, currently sleeping by the pool, was not the first, but part of an ancient tradition that neither fully human nor fully wild, but something in between, something necessary. The images faded, and the pool became still again. The baby had watched the entire display with those impossibly aware eyes, and now reached out toward the water. The guardian gently stopped the tiny hand with one massive paw, then looked at each of the three adults in turn. Her message was clear. They had been shown the truth, the full truth, and now they had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Michael was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion. "The child needs both worlds," he said. "The forest's magic and human knowledge. That's the point, isn't it? To create bridges, not walls." The guardian chuffed softly, a sound of approval, and the baby giggled as if understanding the conversation. Lily nodded, closing the journal carefully. "My grandmother wrote about this, though I never understood until now. The children of the forest, she called them. They're not abandoned or lost, they're chosen." Ethan thought about all the scientific explanations he had tried to apply to what he had witnessed, all the rational frameworks that had crumbled in the face of this reality. "So, what happens now?" he asked. "The baby can't stay in the forest forever, but it can't leave entirely either." The guardian rose and walked to the edge of the grove, where the golden trees grew thickest. She placed her paw against one massive trunk, and where she touched, the bark split open, revealing a hollow space within. But this wasn't just a hollow tree. It was a dwelling, crafted by nature or magic or both into a perfect shelter. Inside the tree was a space that defied the laws of physics, larger than the trunk should have been able to contain. The walls were smooth and warm, glowing with that same soft light, and there were formations that looked like furniture grown from the wood itself. A bed of soft moss, shelves that held objects that looked both ancient and timeless, and in the center, a cradle that seemed to have been waiting for exactly this child. The guardian carried the baby inside and placed it gently in the cradle, which began to rock on its own, continuing the lullaby that the forest itself seemed to sing. "This is where the child will grow," Lily said, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Not abandoned in the wilderness, but held in a space between worlds. And we're the witnesses, the ones who ensure the connection between forest and town remains strong." She turned to Michael. "Your great-great-grandmother knew this. That's why your family was given the responsibility of protecting these woods. You weren't just preventing logging. You were maintaining a sacred trust." Michael pulled out his ancestor's journal, which he had been carrying since Lily had given it to him, and opened it to a page he had marked. "She wrote about a covenant," he said, reading aloud, "between the forest and the people, maintained by blood and promise, renewed each generation by those who remember." He looked up at them. "We're the ones who remember now. We're the keepers of this covenant." The baby made a sound from its cradle, not a cry, but a call, and all three of them moved closer. The infant looked at each of them in turn, those blue eyes holding more awareness than any baby should possess, and then did something extraordinary. The child spoke, not in baby babble, but in a clear, impossible voice that sounded like wind chimes and running water and rustling leaves all at once. "Thank you," the baby said. and then closed its eyes and fell into peaceful sleep. They stayed in the grove for hours, learning its rhythms, understanding their roles in this ancient story. The guardian showed them hidden springs whose water had healing properties, trees whose bark could cure ailments that modern medicine struggled with, flowers that bloomed only once a decade and whose petals could grant visions of possible futures. This wasn't just a forest. It was a living library of natural magic, and they were being given library cards. As the sun began to set, painting the grove in even more impossible colors, they knew it was time to return to the human world. But they also knew they would be back, that this was not an ending, but a beginning. The guardian walked them to the edge of the grove, the baby sleeping peacefully in its tree home, protected by magic older than memory. At the threshold between the grove and the regular forest, the bear did something she had never done before. She stood on her hind legs, towering above them, and placed one paw over her heart, then extended it toward each of them in turn. It was a blessing, a bond, a promise that they were now part of the forest's story forever. The walk back to town was silent, each of them processing what they had witnessed, what they had become part of. The forest seemed different now, not just trees and undergrowth, but a living entity that they were connected to in ways that went beyond the physical. Every bird call was a greeting, every rustle of leaves a reminder of the secret they now carried. As they reached the edge of the woods, where the trees gave way to the first buildings of the town, they paused, looking back at the darkening forest. "Everything changes now," Ethan said, and the others nodded. They had responsibilities beyond their normal lives, a duty to protect not just the physical forest, but the magic it contained, the bridge it represented between worlds. They had to ensure that when the baby was ready to emerge from its forest childhood, the human world would be prepared to receive the gifts it would bring. They had to maintain the covenant, keep the stories alive, prepare the next generation of keepers. In the weeks that followed, they established a routine. Each day, one of them would visit the grove, bringing supplies that might be useful, checking on the baby's progress, learning from the guardian about the forest's needs. The infant grew at a rate that wasn't quite human, developing faster in some ways, slower in others. Within a month, the baby was crawling, exploring the grove under the guardian's watchful eye, but its understanding seemed years beyond its physical development. It would look at them with those knowing eyes and sometimes speak single words that carried the weight of sentences, communicating complex ideas with simple sounds. Michael restructured his entire life around his new role. He convinced the logging company to transform into a conservation organization, using the investors' money to protect rather than destroy. He hired local people to serve as forest rangers, though their real job was to keep the curious away from the sacred spaces while allowing the forest to share its less dangerous gifts with those who approached with respect. He became known as an environmental visionary, though he always credited the transformation to finally listening to wisdom that had been there all along. Lily turned the library into a center for forest education, teaching both the scientific facts about the ecosystem and the older stories that science couldn't quite explain. She created programs for children, knowing that among them might be the next generation's keepers, the ones who would take over when she and the others were gone. She compiled her grandmother's journals and the records of previous keepers into a comprehensive history, though she kept the most sacred secrets in a special collection that only certain people were allowed to see. Ethan found himself changed in ways he was still discovering. His scientific training hadn't abandoned him, but it had expanded to include possibilities he never would have considered before. He published papers about the forest's unique ecosystem that walked the line between conventional science and something more, hinting at mysteries without revealing them entirely. He became known as a bridge between the academic world and indigenous knowledge, though he never revealed the full source of his insights. The baby continued to grow, and with each passing week its connection to both the forest and the human visitors deepened. It learned to walk among the glowing trees, its steps sure and confident on ground that would have tripped any normal child. It began to speak more frequently, its voice a mixture of human language and forest sounds that created meaning beyond words. The guardian remained its primary caregiver, but the bear increasingly included the three humans in the child's education, seeming to understand that this child would need to navigate both worlds. One day, about 3 months after they had first discovered the grove, they arrived to find the baby standing in the center of the pool, the water supporting its weight as if it were solid ground. The child was glowing, not with reflected light, but with an inner radiance that matched the trees around it. "Time soon," the baby said in that impossible voice. "The forest speaks of changes coming. The old barriers grow thin." None of them fully understood what this meant, but they all felt the truth of it, a shift in the air itself that suggested something significant was approaching. That night, Ethan had a dream that felt more like a vision. He saw the forest as it truly was, not just a collection of trees, but a network of consciousness that stretched far beyond the physical boundaries of the woods. He saw other groves like theirs scattered across the world, each protecting a child like theirs, each maintaining the bridge between the human and natural worlds. He saw that what they were part of was bigger than just their forest, bigger than just their town. It was a global awakening, a remembering of connections that modern life had almost severed but not quite destroyed. He woke with the absolute certainty that their role was about to expand. The baby wasn't just being prepared to bridge their local community with nature. It was part of a larger movement, a restoration of balance that the entire world desperately needed. The forest had chosen them not just as protectors, but as initiators of something that would ripple out far beyond their small town. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, he shared his vision with Lily and Michael, and found that they had experienced similar dreams. The forest was communicating with all of them now, not just through the guardian and the baby, but directly, in the language of dreams and intuitions. They were being prepared for something, though none of them knew exactly what. All they could do was trust in the process, maintain their vigilance, and wait for the forest to reveal its larger plan. As autumn approached, the baby began to display abilities that went beyond the merely unusual. It could call animals to the grove with a sound that human ears couldn't quite hear. It could make plants grow with a touch, coaxing flowers to bloom out of season, and trees to bear fruit that shouldn't exist. Most remarkably, it could share its perceptions with others, allowing them to see the forest as it saw it. A living web of connections and consciousness that was both beautiful and overwhelming. During one of these shared visions, Ethan saw something that made him understand the urgency the baby had spoken of. The barriers between worlds weren't just thinning, they were preparing to merge in some way. Not a catastrophic collision, but a gentle weaving together, a recognition that the separation between human and nature had always been an illusion. The children of the forest, scattered across the globe, were the weavers of this integration, and their baby was approaching the age when its true work would begin. Michael was the one who suggested they needed to prepare the town, to gradually introduce people to the ideas that would soon become reality. They couldn't reveal everything, not yet, but they could begin to shift perspectives, open minds to possibilities beyond the ordinary. He organized forest walks that took people to the less magical but still remarkable parts of the woods, letting them feel the edge of the mystery without revealing its heart. He told stories that were mostly true, leaving out only the most unbelievable parts, planting seeds of wonder that would grow into understanding when the time was right. Lily focused on the children, knowing they would be the most receptive to the changes coming. She created after-school programs that taught both environmental science and what she called forest wisdom, the kind of knowledge that couldn't be found in textbooks. She watched for signs of special sensitivity, children who seemed to hear the forest's call more clearly than others, and nurtured their gifts carefully. Among them, she suspected, were future keepers, the ones who would carry on the tradition when the current generation passed on. The investors, particularly the elderly man who had lingered after the meeting, became unexpected allies. He visited the forest himself, and while they never showed him the grove or the baby, they let him experience enough to understand that his investment was protecting something beyond monetary value. He brought others, carefully selected individuals who had influence and open minds, building a network of protectors who didn't fully understand what they were protecting but knew it was important. One evening, as the first frost of the year painted the leaves in silver, the guardian led them to a part of the forest they had never seen before. Here, the trees grew in perfect circles, creating natural amphitheaters, and in the center of the largest circle was something that made them all stop in wonder. It was a tree, but unlike any tree that should exist. Its trunk was massive, easily 30 feet in diameter, and its bark showed patterns that looked like writing in a language that predated human speech. This was the heart of the forest, the oldest tree, the one from which all the others had grown. The guardian approached the tree with a reverence they had never seen from her before, and the baby, now walking confidently beside the bear, placed its tiny hand against the ancient bark. Where the child touched, light spread outward like ripples on water, and the entire tree began to glow with a soft, warm light. The baby turned to look at them, and its eyes were no longer blue, but the deep green gold of forest light. "Soon I will be ready," the child said, its voice carrying the weight of centuries despite coming from such a young throat. "And you must be ready too. The world is about to remember what it forgot." They spent hours at the heart tree, as they came to call it, learning through touch and proximity rather than words. The tree held memories of the forest from its first seedling to the present day, thousands of years of growth and change, destruction and renewal. It showed them other forests that had been lost, and the consequences of those losses. Ecosystems collapsed, weather patterns disrupted, connections severed that could never be fully repaired. But it also showed them hope, the potential for restoration, for a new harmony between human progress and natural wisdom. As winter approached, the baby's growth accelerated again. It was walking and running now with the confidence of a child much older, though it still appeared to be less than a year old. Its speech had evolved from simple words to complex ideas expressed in that strange mixture of human language and forest sounds. It could communicate with any creature in the forest, from the tiniest insect to the guardian herself, and serve as translator between the human visitors and the non-human inhabitants of the woods. The first snow of winter brought an unexpected visitor to the grove. A woman appeared at the edge of the clearing, young, but with eyes that held ancient sadness. She looked at the baby with recognition and longing, and they all knew immediately who she was. The mother had returned, or perhaps had never truly left, existing in some space between the forest and the human world, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The baby showed no surprise at her presence, walking to her with steady steps and taking her hand as if they had never been separated. "I had to give you to the forest," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was the only way to keep you safe, to let you become what you needed to become. But I never left, not really. The forest kept me too in its own way." The guardian approached the woman with the same gentle care she showed the baby, and the woman buried her face in the bear's thick fur, crying tears that seemed to water the very ground they fell upon. The reunion was both joyful and complicated. The woman, whose name was Sarah, had been transformed by her time in the forest's embrace. She could move between the physical and spiritual aspects of the woods, existing in both but belonging fully to neither. She had been preparing for her child's mission, learning what she would need to know to guide the baby through the transition from forest child to bridge between worlds. Her presence completed something, created a balance that had been missing. Sarah told them her story in fragments over the following days. She had been pursued by those who knew about the children of the forest but wanted to exploit rather than protect them. There were organizations, she said, that sought to harness the power these special children represented, to use them for purposes that would destroy the very balance they were meant to maintain. She had fled to the only place she knew would protect her child, even though it meant a separation that had torn her heart apart. But the forest had been kinder than she had dared hope. It had kept her close, in a state between worlds where she could watch her child grow, could learn what she needed to learn, could prepare for the time when they would be reunited. She had seen everything through the forest's eyes, had been present in every rustling leaf and every beam of sunlight that touched her baby's face. The separation had been an illusion. They had never truly been apart. With Sarah's return, the baby's education accelerated. She taught the child things that even the guardian couldn't, human concepts that needed human understanding. But she also learned from her child, who had absorbed the forest's wisdom in ways that no adult could. Together, they were creating something new, a synthesis of human and natural knowledge that had never existed before in quite this way. The town began to notice changes too, subtle at first but increasingly obvious. People reported dreams of talking trees, of animals that seemed to understand human speech, of flowers blooming in impossible colors. Children drew pictures of things they couldn't have seen, scenes from the grove that were too accurate to be imagination. The boundary between the magical forest and the mundane world was becoming more permeable, and not everyone was comfortable with the change. There were those who resisted, who wanted to maintain the separation between human civilization and wild nature. They spoke of danger, of chaos, of the need to maintain order and control. Some even spoke of destroying the forest entirely, of eliminating what they saw as a threat to their understanding of reality. Michael, Lily, and Ethan found themselves not just protecting the forest from physical threats, but from ideological ones as well. They organized town meetings, bringing together those who had experienced the forest's magic and those who feared it. Sarah attended these meetings, the baby in her arms, and her presence had a calming effect that went beyond words. The child would look at the fearful with those impossible eyes and smile, and somehow fear would transform into curiosity. It wasn't magic, exactly, or maybe it was the most natural magic of all. The power of innocence to remind people of wonder they had forgotten. As winter deepened, the baby began to speak at these meetings, its voice carrying despite its small size. It told stories that were simultaneously simple and profound, tales of cooperation between species, of problems solved through understanding rather than force, of the beauty that came from diversity rather than uniformity. Adults who had come to argue found themselves listening like children to a bedtime story, and leaving with their perspectives shifted in ways they couldn't quite explain. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some people left the town, unable to accept the changes happening around them. Others arrived, drawn by rumors of something extraordinary happening in this small mountain community. The economy shifted from resource extraction to something harder to define, a combination of ecological research, spiritual tourism, and what could only be called magical education. The town was becoming something new, a model for a different way of living in relationship with the natural world. One night, during the winter solstice, the forest called them all to the grove. Not just Ethan, Lily, and Michael, but dozens of townspeople who had been touched by the forest's magic. They walked through the snow-covered woods, following paths lit by phosphorescent fungi and guided by animals that appeared just long enough to show the way. When they arrived at the grove, they found it transformed. The trees were shining with a light that had nothing to do with the moon or stars. The pool in the center was not frozen despite the cold, and its surface showed not reflections but visions of forests around the world, each with its own grove, its own child, its own guardian. They could see that what was happening in their small town was part of a global awakening, a remembering that was occurring simultaneously in dozens of places across the planet. The baby, now looking more like a toddler despite being less than a year old, stood at the edge of the pool with Sarah and the guardian flanking it. "Tonight," the child said in that voice of wind and water, "the bridges open fully. What has been separated begins to reunite, not all at once, but steadily, gently, like dawn breaking. You are the witnesses, the midwives of a new world being born from the marriage of the old wisdom and the new." As they watched, the air itself seemed to shimmer, and for a moment they could all see the world as the forest saw it. Every tree was connected to every other tree through underground networks of roots and fungi. Every breath taken by every creature was part of a global exchange of gases that kept the planet alive. Every action rippled out in ways that affected everything else, a web of cause and effect that made the idea of separation laughable. They saw that humans had never been separate from nature, had only convinced themselves they were, and that this illusion was what had caused so much damage. The vision faded, but the understanding remained. They were not just protecting a forest or raising a special child. They were part of a transformation that would take generations to complete, but had already begun. The children of the forest were the catalysts, but every person who opened themselves to the connection was part of the change. The town would be a model, a demonstration that humans could live in harmony with nature without giving up the benefits of civilization, that technology and magic were not opposites, but could be partners. As the gathering dispersed, people walking back through the forest with a new understanding of their place in it, Ethan lingered with the core group. The baby approached him, walking with steady steps through the snow, and took his hand. For a moment, he saw through the child's eyes completely, saw himself not as a separate being, but as part of the forest's extended consciousness, a human branch of a much larger tree. The feeling was overwhelming and beautiful, and when it faded, he found tears freezing on his cheeks. "Thank you," the child said, and in those two words was gratitude, not just from the baby but from the forest itself, from the future that was being born, from possibilities that were becoming real. Ethan squeezed the small hand gently, understanding that his life had found a purpose he never could have imagined when he first walked into these woods seeking solitude. The winter passed with the town adapting to its new reality. Some businesses closed while others opened, offering services that would have seemed absurd a year earlier. Forest wisdom consultations, interspecies communication workshops, natural healing using methods taught by the trees themselves. The local school curriculum expanded to include subjects like ecosystem consciousness and the history of human-forest relations. Children who had been struggling in traditional subjects flourished when taught in ways that honored different kinds of intelligence. Michael's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. The former logging foreman had become something like a forest shaman, able to read the health of the woods through signs invisible to most. He could predict weather changes by the behavior of birds, find healing plants by following intuition, communicate basic concepts to wild animals through body language and intent. His crew, the men who had come to cut down trees, had become the forest's most devoted protectors, using their knowledge of woodland to maintain trails, remove invasive species, and guide visitors safely through the more accessible areas. Lily had evolved into something more than a librarian. She had become a keeper of stories, but also a creator of them, weaving new narratives that helped people understand the changes happening around them. Her library had transformed into a combination of traditional repository and magical archive, where books sometimes fell open to exactly the page a visitor needed to read, where the stories told in children's hour sometimes came true in small ways, where the boundary between fiction and reality was as permeable as the boundary between forest and town. Spring arrived early that year, or perhaps it just seemed that way because the forest around the town burst into bloom with an enthusiasm that defied normal seasonal patterns. Flowers that usually bloomed weeks apart opened simultaneously, creating a tapestry of colors that drew botanists from universities across the country. Birds that had never been seen this far north appeared in the trees, singing songs that harmonized with local species in ways that suggested conscious composition rather than coincidence. The baby, now walking and talking with the confidence of a child several years older, began to venture beyond the grove, always accompanied by either Sarah or the guardian, often both. These expeditions were partly exploration and partly something else, a kind of blessing or activation of different parts of the forest. Wherever the child went, changes followed. Sick trees recovered. Polluted streams ran clear. Areas that had been damaged by past logging began to regenerate at impossible speeds. But more than physical healing, the child brought understanding. Animals that had feared humans began to approach more readily. Plants that had been defensive, thorny or poisonous, became more accessible, as if deciding humans could be trusted again. The forest was learning to forgive, or perhaps it was teaching forgiveness, showing by example that damage could be healed, that broken relationships could be repaired, that it was never too late to choose harmony over conflict. One day in late spring, the child made an announcement that surprised everyone. "It's time for me to go to school," the baby said, looking like a 3-year-old but speaking with wisdom beyond any age. Not to learn from books, though I will do that too, but to teach other children what the forest has taught me, to help them remember what they knew before they were taught to forget. The idea of the forest child attending the local elementary school was both thrilling and terrifying. How would the other children react? How would the teachers handle a student who could communicate with animals and make plants grow with a touch? But Sarah was insistent that her child needed both worlds, needed to be fully part of human society as well as the forest community. After much discussion, it was decided that the child would attend school part-time, spending mornings in the classroom and afternoons in the forest. The first day of school was an event the entire town turned out to witness. The child, dressed in regular clothes but somehow still radiating that otherworldly quality, walked into the building, holding Sarah's hand on one side and, remarkably, the guardian's paw on the other. The bear had never come this far into town before, but she seemed to understand the importance of the moment. She waited outside while the child entered, then settled under a tree to wait, her presence both protective and symbolic. Inside the classroom, something magical happened, though it was a quiet magic, the kind that changes everything without anyone quite noticing how. The forest child didn't perform obvious miracles, didn't make flowers bloom from the desktop, or call birds to the window. Instead, the child simply was, and in being, changed the space around them. The classroom became calmer. Children who usually struggled to focus found themselves absorbed in lessons. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been skeptical about this arrangement, found herself teaching with an inspiration she hadn't felt in years. At recess, the forest child taught the other children games that were old and new at once, games that involved noticing things they had never noticed before. The shape of clouds and what they might mean for tomorrow's weather. The language of birds and what their different calls signified. The way plants grew toward each other or away, and what that said about soil and sunlight and the invisible connections between living things. Within a week, the playground had transformed from a place of chaotic energy to something more like a conscious ecosystem, with children playing in ways that were still fun, but also purposeful, connected. The changes rippled outward from the school into homes. Children came home talking about what the forest child had taught them, not in formal lessons but through play and observation. Parents found themselves drawn into these conversations, remembering their own childhood connections to nature that adult life had buried. Family walks in, the forest became common, and these were different from before, quieter, more observant, more participatory. People weren't just walking through nature, but with it, as part of it. Not everyone was happy with these changes. There were those who saw the forest child as a threat to normal order, who worried about what would happen if children grew up believing they could talk to trees and understand animals. There were heated school board meetings, letters to newspapers, even threats to withdraw children from the school. But for every voice of opposition, there were more voices of support. People who had seen the positive changes in their children, in their community, in themselves. The Guardian became a regular sight in town, waiting outside the school each morning, walking the child home each afternoon. People grew accustomed to seeing the massive bear padding down Main Street, sometimes stopping to sniff at a garden or investigate a bird's nest. Children would wave from windows, and the bear would sometimes stop and perform what could only be described as a bow. The impossible had become normal, or perhaps the normal had expanded to include the impossible. As summer approached, the forest child announced another change. "Others are coming," the child said one day in the grove, looking at the pool that still showed visions of other forests around the world. "Other children like me, other guardians, other keepers. The network is strengthening. The bridges are multiplying. Soon, what is happening here will happen everywhere, each place in its own way, but all connected." The announcement filled them with both excitement and trepidation. They had managed to create something beautiful in their small town, but could it really spread? Could the whole world accept the kind of transformation they had undergone? The forest child seemed to sense their doubts and smiled that impossible smile. "Change doesn't happen all at once," the child said. "It happens one heart at a time, one forest at a time, one choice at a time. But once it begins, it cannot be stopped, only slowed or accelerated." Preparations began for the arrival of the others, though no one knew exactly when they would come or what form their arrival would take. The town expanded its capacity for visitors, not with hotels but with homestays, families opening their doors to those who would come seeking what they had found. The forest grew new paths, or perhaps revealed old ones, creating safe passages to groves and clearings that had been hidden before. The heart tree, the ancient center of the forest, began to glow more brightly, as if preparing for something significant. Michael organized work crews to create gathering spaces in the forest, not by cutting trees but by encouraging them to grow in certain patterns, creating natural amphitheaters and meeting circles. It was slow work, the kind that required patience and partnership with the forest itself, but the results were stunning. Spaces that felt both wild and welcoming, where large groups could gather without damaging the ecosystem, where human presence enhanced rather than diminished the forest's power. Lily worked on creating a curriculum, though that word didn't quite capture what she was developing. It was more like a framework for remembering, ways to help people reconnect with knowledge they had always had, but had forgotten they possessed. She collaborated with educators from around the world who had felt the same calling, creating materials that could be adapted to different ecosystems, different cultures, but all pointing toward the same truth. Humans and nature were not separate, but part of the same living system. Ethan found himself documenting everything, not as a detached scientist, but as a participant observer, someone who was part of the story he was recording. His notes had evolved from purely scientific observations to something more like poetry, trying to capture not just what happened, but how it felt, what it meant. He knew that future generations would need these records, would need to understand not just the facts of the transformation, but the experience of it. Sarah had become something like a bridge herself, helping other parents understand what was happening to their children as more and more of them began showing signs of forest consciousness. She held support groups that were also celebration circles, places where families could share their experiences of children who talked to plants, who knew things they couldn't have learned, who seemed to carry the forest's wisdom in their small bodies. She helped parents understand that their children weren't strange or wrong, but were remembering something essential that the modern world had taught them to forget. The forest child continued to grow and learn, but also to teach and transform. Every day brought new examples of the child's unique gifts. A garden that had been failing suddenly flourished after the child spent an afternoon there. A conflict between neighbors resolved after the child spoke to both parties, not taking sides but helping each see the other's perspective through forest metaphors that somehow made everything clear. A sick pet recovered after the child sat with it, humming that strange melody that the guardian had first sung. One evening in midsummer, as fireflies created constellations in the warm air, the child gathered everyone in the largest of the forest amphitheaters. The space was packed, not just with the original witnesses, but with hundreds of townspeople who had become part of the story. The child stood in the center looking impossibly small and impossibly powerful at once, and began to speak. "The old world is ending," the child said, and despite the dramatic words, the tone was gentle, almost joyful. Not in catastrophe, but in transformation. Like a caterpillar entering a chrysalis, what seems like destruction is actually metamorphosis. We are the imaginal cells of the new world, the ones who dream it into being. Each of you carries part of the pattern. Each of you is essential to what emerges. The child went on to explain, in that voice that was part human and part forest, how the transformation would unfold. It wouldn't be sudden or uniform. Some places would change quickly, others slowly. There would be resistance, confusion, even temporary chaos as old systems gave way to new ones. But the forest would be patient, as it had always been patient. And those who aligned themselves with its wisdom would find themselves supported in ways they couldn't imagine. "Your job," the child said, looking at each person as if speaking directly to them, "is not to force change, but to allow it. To be examples of what's possible when humans remember they are nature too, to create spaces where others can remember, to tell stories that make the impossible seem inevitable, to protect what needs protecting while helping what needs to grow." As the child spoke, the forest itself seemed to respond. Trees that had been still began to sway despite the lack of wind. Flowers that only opened at night began to bloom. Animals emerged from the darkness, not threatening but witnessing, adding their presence to the gathering. Even the stars seemed brighter, as if the universe itself was paying attention to this small clearing where big things were being decided. The meeting lasted until dawn, with people sharing their visions, their fears, their commitments to the transformation. Children fell asleep in their parents' arms, but even in sleep seemed to be participating, their dreams adding to the collective visioning. The guardian sat at the edge of the circle, humming that eternal lullaby, creating a foundation of sound that held everything together. Sarah moved through the crowd, touching shoulders, offering encouragement, being the human mother that balanced the forest mother that the guardian represented. As the sun rose, painting the forest in gold and green, the child made one final announcement. Tomorrow, the others begin to arrive. Children from other forests, other bridges between worlds. They will need your welcome, your support, your stories. Together, we will weave a net of connection that covers the earth, each thread strengthening the others. The forest's time has come again, not to dominate but to partner, not to return to the past, but to create a future where wisdom and progress dance together. The gathering dispersed slowly, people reluctant to leave the magic of the moment. But as they walked back through the forest, they carried that magic with them. Seeds of transformation that would be planted in homes, schools, workplaces. The impossible had become not just possible but inevitable, and they were all part of making it real. That night, Ethan stood at the edge of the forest, looking back at the trees that had changed his life so completely. He thought about the scientist he had been, seeking solitude and finding community, seeking answers and finding mysteries that were better than any answer. The forest hummed with life, with purpose, with promise. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new wonders, new bridges to build between worlds. But tonight, in this moment, everything was perfect, poised on the edge of transformation like the world holding its breath before dawn. The next morning arrived with a quality of light that seemed different, more golden, more alive. The whole town felt it. A sense of anticipation that had people looking toward the forest, toward the sky, toward each other with expressions of expectant wonder. The forest child had been up before dawn, standing at the edge of the grove with Sarah and the guardian, all three facing east as if waiting for something specific. It began as a sound, a harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then the trees at the eastern edge of the forest began to glow, not with their usual phosphorescence, but with a light that pulsed in rhythm with the sound. Through that light came figures, walking with the same purposeful grace that the guardian displayed. They were children, but like the forest child, they carried themselves with a wisdom that transcended their apparent age. With each child walked a guardian, some bears like their guardian, others different. A wolf, an elk, an eagle that perched on a child's shoulder, each one radiating the same ancient presence. The forest child ran forward to greet them, and the meeting was like watching streams converge into a river. The children embraced, spoke in languages that weren't quite human but were perfectly understood, shared knowledge through touch and glance that would have taken hours to convey in words. The guardians, too, greeted each other with a familiarity that suggested this was a reunion rather than a first meeting, as if they were all aspects of the same greater consciousness temporarily inhabiting different forms. The townspeople who had gathered to witness this arrival stood in awed silence. Here was proof that what they had experienced wasn't unique to their forest, but was part of something global, something that had been planned, or perhaps had emerged naturally from the Earth's need to heal itself. Each child was different, their features reflecting the regions they came from, but they all shared that same quality of being bridges, existing fully in neither the human nor the natural world, but perfectly in both. Over the following days, the visiting children and their guardians were integrated into the town's life. Each brought gifts from their own forests, knowledge and abilities that complemented what the local forest child had developed. One child from a rainforest in South America could call rain or disperse it, working with weather in ways that seemed to violate meteorology but followed deeper patterns. Another, from a northern boreal forest, understood the language of stones and soil, able to sense mineral deposits and underground water with perfect accuracy. The children attended school together, and their combined presence transformed the educational experience entirely. Lessons became living things, with mathematics explained through the spiral patterns of shells and galaxies, history told through the memory of trees that had witnessed centuries, science demonstrated through direct observation of natural phenomena that the children could somehow make visible. The other students, rather than feeling overshadowed, found their own connections to the natural world awakening, as if the forest children were tuning forks that helped others find their own frequency. Michael organized the guardians into what he half-jokingly called a council, though their meetings were nothing like human governmental gatherings. They would sit in a circle in the forest, sometimes for hours, without any apparent communication. Yet afterward, coordinated actions would unfold as if detailed plans had been made. New paths would appear in the forest exactly where they were needed. Problems in the ecosystem would resolve before they became critical. The balance between human activity and forest health would maintain itself without obvious intervention. Lily documented the stories each child brought, tales from forests around the world that revealed a hidden history of cooperation between humans and nature. There had always been bridge children, she learned, but in recent centuries their numbers had dwindled as forests were destroyed and the old knowledge was forgotten. Now, as the world faced ecological crisis, the forests were calling forth more bridges than ever before, a last great effort to restore balance before it was too late. One evening, the eldest of the visiting children, a girl who looked perhaps 10, but whose eyes held centuries, gathered everyone for what she called a weaving. In the heart grove, around the ancient tree, she had the children stand in a circle, each with their guardian behind them. Then she began to sing, a song without words that seemed to pull threads of light from each child, threads that met in the center and began to create a pattern of incredible complexity. As the pattern grew, those watching began to see what it represented. It was a map, but not of geography. It was a map of connections, showing how every forest on Earth was linked to every other, how actions in one place rippled out to affect all places, how the health of the whole depended on the health of each part. They saw that the forests weren't just collections of trees, but organs in a larger organism, the Earth itself, and that humans weren't separate from this organism but cells within it that had forgotten their function. The weaving continued through the night, and as it did, reports came in from around the world. Other groups of forest children were performing the same ceremony, all synchronized despite no apparent communication. Satellites detected unusual energy signatures from forests globally. Scientists recorded electromagnetic phenomena they couldn't explain. Animals exhibited coordinated behaviors across vast distances. Something fundamental was shifting, not violently but inexorably, like a tide turning. When dawn came and the weaving was complete, the pattern hung in the air for a moment, visible to all, then dissolved into motes of light that settled onto everything and everyone present. Each person felt it as a warm tingling, a sense of connection not just to the forest but to all forests, all life, everywhere. The artificial boundaries that humans had created, between nations, between species, between human and nature, suddenly seemed not just wrong, but absurd, like claiming your hand was separate from your arm. The visiting children stayed for a full moon cycle, teaching and learning, weaving the local forest more tightly into the global network they were creating. Then, one by one, they began to return to their own forests, but the connections remained. The townspeople found they could sometimes sense what was happening in distant forests, receive knowledge from trees on other continents, understand weather patterns not through meteorology but through feeling the Earth's breathing. The Forest Child, their original bridge, had grown during this time, not just physically but in capability. The child could now not just communicate with individual plants and animals but with entire ecosystems, conducting symphonies of interaction that maintained balance and promoted flourishing. When problems arose, the child would often solve them not through direct action, but by adjusting relationships, helping different species understand how they could support each other, turning competition into cooperation. The town itself had become unrecognizable from what it had been a year earlier. Buildings were being modified to incorporate living trees. Gardens weren't just producing food, but were conscious spaces where humans and plants collaborated. The economy had shifted entirely from extraction to regeneration, with people finding livelihoods in tending, teaching, and translating between human and natural systems. Visitors came from around the world, not as tourists but as pilgrims, seeking to understand how to replicate this transformation in their own communities. But perhaps the most significant change was in the children. Not just the forest children, but all the children. They were growing up with a fundamentally different understanding of reality, one where consciousness wasn't limited to humans, where cooperation was more natural than competition, where the health of the whole was understood to be essential to the health of the individual. They played games that would have seemed like magic to previous generations, but were simply based on understanding and working with natural patterns rather than against them. Sarah had evolved into something like a priestess, though she would have laughed at that title. She helped people navigate the spiritual and emotional aspects of the transformation, the grief for the old world that was passing, the fear of the unknown that was emerging, the joy of reconnection that came with accepting their place in the larger organism. She held ceremonies that were part therapy, part ritual, part celebration, helping people release old patterns and embrace new ones. One day, as autumn began to paint the forest in fire colors, the Forest Child made an announcement that shocked everyone. "I will be leaving soon," the child said, looking like a 5-year-old but speaking with ageless authority. "Not forever, but for a time. There are other places that need what I've learned here, other communities ready to bridge. The Guardian will remain, as will the connections we've built. And I will return when the time is right." The announcement sparked a mixture of sadness and understanding. They had always known the Forest Child wasn't theirs to keep, that the child belonged to something larger than their small town. But the thought of separation, even temporary, was painful. The child seemed to understand this and spent the following weeks visiting each person who had been part of the journey, offering words of comfort and wisdom, leaving gifts of insight that would sustain them during the absence. The child's departure was marked by a ceremony that the entire town attended. In the Heart Grove, under stars that seemed especially bright, the child stood with Sarah and the Guardian, the three who had been at the center of this transformation. The child spoke of gratitude, of love, of the unbreakable bonds that had been formed. Then, walking to the ancient tree, the child placed both hands on its bark and seemed to merge with it, becoming light that flowed into the wood and disappeared. For a moment, there was absolute silence, a sense of loss that was almost unbearable. Then the tree began to glow, brighter than ever before, and in that light they all felt the child's presence, not gone but transformed, spread throughout the entire forest, present in every leaf and root, every bird, song, and wind whisper. The child had not left, but had become part of the forest itself, a consciousness that would always be there, guiding and protecting, even when not visible in human form. Sarah collapsed into the Guardian's embrace, sobbing with a mixture of grief and pride, and the Great Bear held her with infinite tenderness, humming that eternal lullaby that promised all separations were temporary, all losses were transformations, all endings were beginnings. The townspeople slowly dispersed, each carrying a piece of the child's light within them, each knowing their lives had been permanently altered by this experience. In the days that followed, they discovered the child had been right. The connections remained strong. The forest continued to teach and guide. The guardian maintained her vigilant presence, now watching over not just one special child, but an entire community that had become special through its willingness to bridge worlds. And sometimes, in the rustling of leaves or the pattern of sunlight through branches, they could feel the forest child's presence, changed but not gone, distributed but not diminished. The transformation of the town continued, but at a deeper level now, less dramatic but more thorough. People found themselves changing in subtle ways, becoming more patient, more observant, more connected. Conflicts that would have escalated into arguments resolved through sudden understanding. Projects that would have required force or struggle flowed into completion with surprising ease. The town was learning to function like a forest, with each person playing their part in a larger organism that was wise beyond any individual understanding. Michael's role evolved from protector to teacher, as people from other communities came to learn how to work with rather than against natural systems. He taught them not through lectures but through experience, taking them into the forest, helping them feel the connections, showing them how to listen to what the earth was trying to tell them. Many arrived skeptical and left transformed, carrying seeds of change back to their own communities. Lily's library had become something between a school and a temple, a place where knowledge wasn't just stored but lived. Books would fall open to exactly the right page. Stories would write themselves, appearing in notebooks left overnight. Children would discover they could read languages they had never learned, understanding them through some deeper knowing that transcended mere translation. The boundary between information and wisdom had dissolved, and the library had become a place where both were freely available to those ready to receive them. Winter came gently that year, the forest easing into dormancy like a great creature settling into sleep. But even in the cold and silence, the connections remained vibrant. People found themselves dreaming shared dreams, waking with knowledge they hadn't had when they fell asleep. The town functioned with a coordination that seemed impossible, everyone knowing what needed to be done without being told, showing up where they were needed without being asked. On the winter solstice, exactly 1 year after the forest child had first spoken at the town gathering, something extraordinary happened. Children throughout the town, ordinary children who had been touched by the forest child's presence, began to glow with the same soft light the forest child had emanated. Not all the time, but in moments of joy or deep concentration, their skin would shimmer with that phosphorescence that marked them as bridges in training. Parents brought their glowing children to the grove, where the guardian waited with what could only be described as a smile. She examined each child gently, sniffing them, nuzzling them, and each time nodding as if confirming something. These children were the next generation of bridges, not as powerful as the forest child, but numerous enough to maintain the connections that had been established. The forest had ensured its own continuity, creating a distributed network rather than relying on single special individuals. Sarah took on the role of teaching these new bridge children, helping them understand and control their emerging abilities. She taught them the songs the guardian had hummed, the movements that helped them connect with plants, the stillness that allowed them to hear what animals were saying. She was patient and loving, seeing in each child a reflection of her own miraculous child, now part of the forest itself. As spring returned, so did the forest child, not in the same form but recognizable nonetheless. The child appeared first as a shimmer in the air, then solidified into a form that was older, perhaps appearing 7 or 8 years old now, with eyes that held the depth of the forest itself. The reunion was joyful but different, for everyone understood now that the child was no longer just an individual, but a node in a vast network of consciousness that spanned the globe. "The weaving is nearly complete," the child announced, and they could hear in that voice echoes of all the forests of the world. The old world and the new are no longer separate but layered, existing in the same space, available to those who choose to see. The transformation cannot be stopped now. It will take time, generations perhaps, but the direction is set. Humanity is remembering its place in the family of life. The child stayed for only a few days this time, long enough to strengthen connections, to teach new songs to the bridge children, to remind everyone of their purpose. Then the child departed again, but this time there was no sadness. Everyone understood that the child was not leaving but expanding, becoming present in more places, touching more lives, weaving more connections in the great web that was being restored. The town had become a beacon, an example of what was possible when humans chose cooperation over domination, when they recognized themselves as part of nature rather than separate from it. Delegations came from governments, from corporations, from universities, all wanting to understand how this transformation had occurred, how it could be replicated. Some left frustrated, unable to grasp that the change couldn't be mandated or manufactured, but had to be allowed, nurtured, chosen. Others left with seeds of possibility, returning to their homes to begin their own slow transformations. Years passed, and the children who had begun to glow that winter solstice grew into young adults who carried the forest's wisdom into every field of human endeavor. They became scientists who understood that consciousness wasn't limited to brains, artists who could capture the voice of the wind, healers who worked with the body's natural systems rather than against them, leaders who made decisions based on what would benefit the whole rather than the few. They were creating the new world not through revolution but through evolution, changing human society from within like the forest, changing from season to season. The guardian grew older, her muzzle gray now, her movements slower but still graceful. She had trained younger bears to serve as guardians, teaching them the songs, the patience, the fierce love required to protect the bridge between worlds. When she finally lay down for the last time in the grove where it had all begun, the entire town came to pay their respects. She died as she had lived, with dignity and purpose, and where her body returned to the earth, new trees grew overnight, trees that glowed with an inner light that would never fade. Sarah, too, aged, though more slowly than normal humans, as if her time in the forest's embrace had changed her at a cellular level. She became the elder teacher, the keeper of the first stories, the one who could remember when the transformation had begun. Children and grandchildren of the original witnesses would come to her to hear about the early days, when a baby in the forest had changed everything, when impossible things had become everyday miracles. Ethan continued to document, his scientific training now fully integrated with his expanded understanding of consciousness and connection. He wrote books that were used in the new schools that were emerging everywhere, schools that taught children to learn from nature as much as from books, to develop their intuition alongside their intellect, to see themselves as part of the living world rather than separate from it. His work became foundational to the new science that was emerging, one that included consciousness as a fundamental force rather than an emergent property. Michael's transformation from logger to protector became a parable told around the world, an example of how even those who had participated in destruction could become agents of regeneration. He established training programs for others who wanted to make similar transitions, teaching them that the skills used to harvest could be redirected to heal, that the same knowledge that had been used to dominate nature could be used to partner with it. He died peacefully one autumn afternoon, sitting against a tree he had once planned to cut down, and the tree was found to have grown around him, incorporating his body into its trunk, making him literally part of the forest he had protected. Lily's library evolved into something that existed partially in physical space and partially in what could only be called dream space. Visitors would sometimes find rooms that hadn't been there before, containing exactly the books they needed. Stories would sometimes come alive, their characters walking through the town, teaching through their presence before dissolving back into narrative. The boundary between story and reality had become permeable, and Lily presided over this magical space with the joy of someone who had always known that stories were more than entertainment. They were instructions for transformation. The forest child continued to appear periodically, each time in a different form, sometimes older, sometimes younger, sometimes barely human in appearance, sometimes so ordinary-looking that only the depth of those eyes revealed the true nature. The child had become something like a force of nature, present everywhere forests were being restored, everywhere bridges were being built between human and natural worlds. The child was no longer an individual, but an archetype, a possibility that existed in every human who chose to remember their connection to the living earth. As decades passed, what had begun in one small town spread across the world, not as a single movement, but as thousands of local transformations, each unique but all connected. Forests that had been destroyed began to regenerate at speeds that defied conventional understanding. Species that had been near extinction began to recover. Weather patterns that had been disrupted by human activity began to stabilize. The earth itself seemed to be healing, not through human technology, but through human remembering, through the restoration of relationships that should never have been severed. The town where it had all begun became a place of pilgrimage, but not in the traditional sense. People came not to worship, but to remember, to reconnect with parts of themselves they had forgotten existed. They would walk in the forest, now vast and vibrant, and sometimes catch glimpses of the magic that had become everyday reality for the residents. They would sit by the pool in the grove and see visions of their own role in the great transformation. They would touch the ancient tree, now even more massive and radiant, and feel the presence of all who had contributed to this change, including the forest child who had started it all. Children born in this new world grew up unable to understand how humans had ever thought they were separate from nature. To them, talking with trees was as natural as talking with people. Understanding the needs of the ecosystem was as basic as understanding their own needs. They played games that previous generations would have called magic, but which were simply based on working with natural laws that had always existed but had been ignored. They grew into adults who created technologies that enhanced rather than destroyed, who built cities that were living ecosystems, who saw no conflict between human progress and natural harmony. The story of the forest child became a myth told around the world, though those who had been there knew it was also history. Different cultures adapted it to their own contexts, adding their own details, their own meanings, but the core remained the same. A child given to the forest for protection, raised by a guardian who was more than animal, becoming a bridge between worlds that had forgotten they were one. It was a story that explained how the great transformation had begun, how humanity had remembered its place in the family of life. But more than history or myth, it was an ongoing reality. In forests around the world, there were still special children being born, children who carried the potential to be bridges. There were still guardians, animals who had accepted the role of protecting and teaching these children. There were still groves where the veil between worlds was thin, Where magic was just another word for natural laws humanity was still discovering. The transformation that had begun with one baby in one forest had become a permanent feature of human existence, a reminder that separation had always been an illusion, and connection had always been the truth. On a spring morning, exactly 50 years after Ethan had first heard the humming in the forest, a new group of visitors arrived at the town. They were scientists, but of the new kind, trained in both measurement and mystery, equally comfortable with equations and intuitions. They had come to study the forest, to try to understand in scientific terms what had happened here. The town welcomed them, as they welcomed all seekers, and assigned them a guide. The guide was a young woman whose eyes held that familiar depth, whose movements had that characteristic grace of one who existed in multiple worlds simultaneously. She led them into the forest, along paths that seemed to appear just as they were needed, to a clearing where an enormous bear sat watching over a group of playing children. The children looked ordinary except for the way light seemed to gather around them, except for the way plants leaned toward them, except for the way their laughter harmonized with the wind. "This is where it began," the guide said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the trees around them. "And this is where it continues. The forest child you've heard about isn't gone, just distributed. Every one of these children carries a piece of that original bridge. Every tree remembers the first song. Every breath of wind carries the promise that was made here, that humans and nature would remember they are one." The scientists set up their equipment, trying to measure what couldn't quite be measured, to quantify what existed partially outside the realm of quantity. But they also sat quietly, allowing themselves to feel what their instruments couldn't detect, to understand with parts of themselves that their training had never acknowledged. One by one, they began to experience the shift, the expansion of awareness that came from accepting connection rather than maintaining separation. As the sun set on that day, painting the forest in the golden light that had marked so many transformations, the guide smiled. She was, of course, the forest child, or one aspect of the forest child, or perhaps a new forest child carrying on the tradition. The distinction no longer mattered. What mattered was that the bridge remained strong, that the connection continued to grow, that the transformation which had begun with one impossible baby in a forest clearing had become the new reality for all of humanity. The guardian, a descendant of the original but carrying the same ancient wisdom, hummed the eternal lullaby as the children settled for sleep. The sound carried through the forest, through the town, through the connections that now spanned the globe. It was a song of ending and beginning, of separation and unity, of the old world that had passed and the new world that was still being born. It was a promise that the forest would always protect those who protected it, that the bridge between worlds would never again be forgotten, that the child who had been given to the forest had given humanity back to itself. As darkness fell and stars emerged, each one seeming to pulse in rhythm with the glowing trees, the forest settled into its nighttime consciousness. Somewhere in that vast network of connection, the original forest child's awareness persisted, not as an individual but as a quality of being that had been awakened in thousands, perhaps millions of humans around the world. The transformation was complete, yet it was also just beginning. The bridge had been built, and now it was time to see what wonders would cross it in both directions for generations to come.